Looking at issues without taking sides. That's what Agenda Alexandria has been doing since 1998. Everything from capacity in our schools, to the political environment, to the sewer outfalls, to affordable housing. There's no issue that's off the table.
On the Agenda is the podcast version of Agenda Alexandria, where we invite in key decision makers and experts to our studio to get a sense of what's really going on in Alexandria.
I'm Eileen Cassidy Rivera.
And I'm Michael Pope. And this is
On the Agenda.
On the agenda today, affordable housing. Eileen, you know, on the campaign trail in Alexandria, there is no topic that receives more discussion than affordable housing. When candidates are running for city council, they're running for mayor, they are constantly talking about the issue of affordable housing and how Alexandria has lost so much affordable housing. It's one of those issues where people talk about it a lot, but they don't always know the details about how affordable housing works. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today on the agenda. And we've got the best panelists to help us through this issue. Helen McIlvaine is the director of the Office of Housing in Alexandria, and Kayla Hornbrook is communications associate at the Alexandria Housing Development Corporation. And we are going to set the table for our discussion by going to the Agenda Alexandria stage, where Agenda Alexandria recently discussed the issue of affordable housing in a panel, a very lively panel. One of the things that we always do at Agenda Alexandria is take questions from the audience. And it was one of these questions that had a very interesting interchange here between Frank Fannin, who is the vice chairman of Agenda Alexandria, and
a former city councilman.
And a former city councilman. And Michelle Crocker, who is the head of the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance. So let's see what happened on the Agenda Alexandria stage, and then we'll circle back around and talk about it.
There's a pretty pointed question here, and I'll even try to answer this one. It says, why is there no voice on the panel against affordable housing? Okay, so the topic of our conversation is affordable housing. Affordable for who? So is there anybody in this room, no matter what your income is or what your bracket is, that you wouldn't want to have access to affordable housing? Okay, so if you want to live somewhere and not be able to pay, that's fine. Okay, so here's a real life example. So I've been in the mortgage business for years. I just did a loan recently for a woman in Delray. She's lived there for 40 years. She has a home worth about $700,000. She makes $60,000 a year, and she has to now probably leave Alexandria. She wants to stay here, but she came up and just said, you know, my tax bill is $9,000 a year to live here in the city of Alexandria. So even though her net worth is maybe $500,000 if she sold her house, she doesn't have affordable housing. So there's wealthy people that don't have affordable housing. So it's a problem on all levels here in the city of Alexandria. And so this woman's solution is she's selling her home, she's going to take her money and move to the Shenandoah Valley, even though she doesn't want to do that, but that's where she can find affordable housing. Sure.
I think there's also a question of values, who we are as a city. Do we want to become a city of haves and have-nots? Do we value the diversity, both economic, racial, social, in our city? That's what makes Alexandria vibrant and thriving. So housing affordability, again, is not just for the household that lives in it. There are a whole host of reasons that are good for the community. There's a mountain of study and statistics about a child's educational outcomes when they live in stable, affordable housing. There are mountains of studies about the value to our transportation system when we have housing for the workforce near our transit areas. So there are lots of good reasons. There are lots of community benefits that happen when we have housing choices in the community.
So one of the most interesting things there is that question. It was a very pointed question, which is at the heart of our discussion, which is, why is this something that anybody should care about, right? Why is this something that a city government should invest money in preserving and creating? Helen, I'll put the question to you. Why do this? Why have affordable housing? Why is this something people should be concerned about and invest in?
Well, I think a few things. First, the housing master plan looked at sort of a housing for all, that people's life circumstances change as they age and go through different life stages. And so a person may, the example of someone who is aging in their home but can no longer pay the real estate taxes. I hope they've looked into some of the city's property tax relief programs, but that's something we hear about a lot, that people, as they get onto fixed incomes, may not be able to remain in Alexandria or need modifications to their homes. I think the other thing that we tried to do when we were doing the housing master plan was to give people the idea of how critical having a range of workers was to our local economy. Many households depend on healthcare providers, on daycare providers, on nannies, on house cleaners. We all depend on folks to wait on us at the restaurants and in service occupations, and our economy as a place that offers hospitality also has just a series of jobs that people need housing affordability. So I think one of the big takeaways from the housing master plan was having housing affordability is critical to having both a vibrant economy and a place that is competitive and attractive to employers. And I think the other reason to do it is just as Michelle was saying, that one of Alexandria's core values, it's in our strategic plan, is that we are a diverse and welcoming community, and we are an inclusive community. And the way we demonstrate that the best is by providing housing affordability.
And Kayla, I'll put the same question to you. Mm-hmm. So with your work in the Alexandria Housing Development Corporation, why is affordable housing a goal, and how does your organization help accomplish that?
So affordable housing, like Michelle said, like Helen said, is critical to making sure that we have a diverse and vibrant economy, and that we have a diverse and vibrant culture as well. I think somewhere in the video they say that 50% of the Alexandria population turns over every 6 years. And I think in one of my previous jobs, I was fortunate enough to work with people who had been in Alexandria for decades, 50 to 60, and they have stories that can talk about what Potomac Yard looked like decades ago, and to be able to kind of have that institutional preservation, housing affordability is a part of that narrative, so that younger folks like myself can get here and stay here and put down roots here, in addition to everything that's very valuable and true about making sure that our hospitality and our retail workers and our healthcare workers and our education professionals can live in the city as well. What we do to make that easier as a nonprofit developer is we build those units. So we build units utilizing a variety of financial incentives and instruments that are available to the nonprofit development community to provide that housing.
What I find so interesting is that I think it was in 1979 was that Alexandria became one of the first jurisdictions in the country to have a resolution. It was Resolution 830, right?
Yeah.
Are y'all familiar with that? And that for every unit of affordable housing that would be either like torn down or redeveloped, that the city would have to resurrect or build one to replace it, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a long time ago, right? That was. Can I
piggyback on this? Yeah. Because Helen actually alerted me to the interesting history of the creation of the Resolution 830, which has to do with the construction of the Braddock Road Metro Station, right? Which used to be the location of public housing. It was demolished to build the Metro Station. So, Helen, talk about the creation of Resolution 830.
Well, I think both because of the condition of some of the public housing, and as well as the fact its location that potentially got in the way of some of the city's very necessary economic development and transportation projects. City Council, in what I think is one of its finest hours, said
Too few of those.
No comment. I would say I don't agree with that. But
just a little joke.
But frankly, when you read Resolution 830, it says we want the residents of public housing to live in security. So I think that word that came up earlier, security. And so with the housing authority, they agreed that if a public housing unit were demolished or redeveloped, there would be security both in terms of identifying replacement units that would be substantially equivalent, as well as all of the other things that occur during redevelopment, like what's going to happen during the relocation and how will people's rights be protected. So the language is really very awesome. We're in a process right now to modernize it. But I would say it's a commitment. The other thing, just in terms of the context, it reflects the fact that at that time, our hub was really the main housing affordability provider. Today, we're very fortunate. We have an environment where we have AHDC, the organization that Kayla is with, as well as many other nonprofit and private developers who are interested in providing housing affordability.
All right, now at this point in our discussion, I want to get in the time machine and go back to the 1980s when Alexandria created the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which, the 1980s was a time when Alexandria was rapidly losing its stock of affordable housing. And there was lots of concern about government employees, restaurant workers being priced out of the city. And so Vola Lawson, who was the city manager at the time, wanted to do something about this. She's quoted in the newspapers at the time as having a press conference, and she's quoted saying, for low-income families, this is the worst of times. Vola was very literary in her speech.
She was.
This is a crisis of epic proportions. And so she got together with Tom Davis and a few other
Former
leaders.
congressman from Northern Virginia.
He was congressman at the time.
Oh, he was, that's right.
I'm sorry, no, wait a second. I think he was with the Fairfax County at the time. Yeah, he was the Fairfax County
Right.
supervisor at the time. This is before he was in Congress. And so it was Vola Lawson and Fairfax supervisor Tom Davis and Arlington County board member Al Eisenberg, and they got together to do something about affordable housing crisis at the time from a regional perspective. But Helen, talk about the creation of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund back in the 1980s. Was Alexandria kind of a pioneer ahead of its time?
We absolutely were. We were maybe the first, but among the first jurisdictions even to think about what tools do we need to preserve and produce affordable housing. And the trust fund was the result of that. And it is primarily a voluntary contribution that's made by developers, and it recognizes that the city needs funds in order to be able to work with partners and save or produce housing.
Helen, can I ask you just a quick question? I don't mean to interrupt, but you talk about a voluntary contribution. So it's really up to the developer if that developer wants to contribute. Is there any incentive for them to
Bonus density.
Well, and with bonus density, we actually, in the case of bonus density, we can actually require on-site affordable housing. But no, the financial contributions, monetary contributions, are actually voluntary. I think the reason we've had such good cooperation and support for that is that we've worked with the development community to develop those rates and sort of policy guidelines around it. And I think that, people, I will say also, in other jurisdictions, developers do it as well. So they know that that's potentially an expectation of development. But I think in Alexandria, they respect the fact that our city council is very interested in this issue and is probably going to be looking at development and saying, what is the developer potentially offering to support our affordable housing program?
So now, in the 80s and in the 90s, the approach to affordable housing was very different back then than the way people approach it now, like with the Housing Development Corporation didn't exist in the 80s and 90s, right? Mm-hmm. So what, in those early years, the goal of the city, or essentially the way that this city approached the goal of preserving affordable housing, was to essentially get its hands on garden apartments, right? These are places built in the 1940s, 1950s. And so, Helen, talk a little bit about the early years of the trust fund and the way the city went about accomplishing this goal of preserving affordable housing.
Sure. Well, most of the money in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund at that time was used to acquire and renovate garden stock, just as you said, and to then put in a program that would keep rents affordable at certain income levels. And this was partly because the city had, as you mentioned, had been tracking where are rents going? And the units were there, so when we say they were lost, the units remained, but the rents had gone up so much that people at different income bands could no longer afford them. And so the idea was, let's save the stuff that everyone recognizes provides sort of a market affordable price point.
And you know who talks about this is one of our Agenda Alexandria panelists, Keith Pettigrew, who's the head of the Public Housing Authority in Alexandria, known as ARHA. And so we're going to look at soundbite number 2 here, where on the Agenda Alexandria stage, Keith Pettigrew talks about the importance of preserving affordable housing in terms of who benefits from it.
When I was in New Orleans, a question came up about land, the value of the land, and why don't we sell the land and have those people that have been living there move someplace else. But it's a basic thing for me. This is their neighborhood too. And whatever we can do to help them come back to their neighborhood, we should. So I understand when people ask about public funds and why not people move to places where they can obviously live. And a lot of people do. But also you got to understand something. It's their neighborhood too. And they should have a right to come back. And if we can figure out a way to fund it and to bring them back to the neighborhood, we should always do that. So.
And now I want us to get back into our time machine again and fast forward to the creation of the Alexandria Housing Development Corporation, which was
2004.
2004. Okay. So what the heck is the Housing Development Corporation?
Right. So HDC was founded in 2004. City Council and a citizen work group came together and said we need to have a local nonprofit option that can do work exclusively in the city to help us deal with the housing affordability issues that we're seeing, including, this is the run-up to 2008. Housing market's getting hotter, and they birth HDC from that process. So we're a nonprofit. We work very closely with the city, but we're not a city agency, but we only develop within Alexandria. So we can provide local, smaller solutions to things that other developers in the area might not approach. In addition, because we have such a close working relationship with the city, we're able to respond to needs that we see coming down the development line in a very tactile way. So we're founded in 2004, and then our first project was the station, which opened in 2009. And the station it was at its time a first of its kind partnership between a nonprofit developer and the Alexandria Fire Department. So the Potomac Yard area needs a new fire station, and from what I was reading, it was in the Alexandria Times yesterday, somebody said it would be a waste of airspace to let that one-story fire station never have something that goes above it. And so they worked with the developer and brought HDC on board, and we developed the station. So there's a fire station on the ground level, and then above that, there's 64 units of affordable housing, including a garden terrace, which we went out and looked at today.
Beautiful.
We provide fresh produce to our residents who live there with this garden terrace that is situated over the fire station entry-exit port for its vehicles, fire trucks. I do know that word. So yeah, we opened the station then in 2009.
Almost 10 years now. Right?
Yes, which is
It's hard to believe.
the 1990s feel like it was yesterday. So the station opens in 2009, and then after that we pursued. We did a garden renovation project. So while that was a thing of the 80s, in the 2011 timeframe, we acquired 3 garden-style apartment buildings that were at risk of being sold. Their owner had gone into financial hardship. So we acquired and renovated those with assistance from the city. 2 of them were renovated in 2014, and then we're currently in the process of finishing the last one right now.
That's great.
You know what I think is really interesting about the timing here is that in the 80s and 90s, the city was involved in acquiring these garden apartments and preserving the units. And then right around the time the Housing Development Corporation was created, there was a lot of different stuff that was going on with the topic of affordable housing. There was also the penny set-aside that was done like right around the same time as the Housing Development Corporation was created. And also, the city made a very smart hire with Helen McIlvaine, who came aboard the city right around that same time period. And she came from Arlington, where she pioneered something that in the industry they call stuff on top of stuff, right?
Yes.
Helen, talk about your time in Arlington before you came to Alexandria and this concept of stuff on top of stuff.
Thank you, Michael. Sure, I was with a nonprofit called the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, and we acted as the developer for the First Baptist Church of Clarendon. And the idea for that project, of course, it was right across from the Clarendon Metro station, and what had once been the tallest building in that part of Arlington with the church steeple.
Very controversial, too. There was a lot of pushback from the neighborhood residents, right?
Several lawsuits, more than pushback. But the church wanted to do something. It saw the housing crisis in Arlington and wanted to respond to needs of neighbors, and was facing issues with the church facility, frankly. It had an aging congregation, and the church was no longer accessible, or had never been accessible. So they looked at plans to add housing above the church. And interestingly, they were willing to take down the whole church, but the community was very attached to the steeple. So the steeple survives to this day, but they replaced the worship space, and they built 10 stories of affordable housing on top.
And created a model that's now being replicated all over the country
Yes.
and in several places in
The
Alexandria.
stuff on top of stuff model, right?
Yeah.
But isn't the more modern term, and isn't it really now called or referred to as density? Meaning is like a density strategy to decide how much stuff on top of stuff will be built and what the toleration is, right, in the neighborhoods for wanting more stuff?
Well, I think it's the reality in a place like Alexandria that has very little land that's
Right.
not already built. So you have to think much more creatively about going up, because
Yeah.
you have development rights above, one-story projects. And I think this was it was not only smart to think about how can we combine two big city needs, but I think it was also because of being in Potomac Yard and being a project where we did really a lot of outreach and brought the public in, and then for a very long time was the only building. I think it really helped people see affordable housing differently and say housing should be lots of places, and it can be co-located with lots of other uses.
Eileen, it's interesting your comment about density and the concerns people have about
Right.
too much density. On the Agenda Alexandria stage, we had a realtor, Steve Hayes from Berkshire Hathaway, and he talks about this issue of people's concerns about growth and development, and is Alexandria being overdeveloped, essentially. And he had a very interesting perspective on that.
I grew up in upstate New York, in Binghamton, New York is where I'm from. Binghamton, New York has 150,000 residents. In 1980, Binghamton, New York had 300,000 residents. Every time I go, my dad worked for IBM for 30 years, there was a big IBM presence there. Every time I go home to visit friends or family that are there, it's depressing. It's an area that is completely fallen off the grid. There's no development, there's nothing going on there. When I see cranes everywhere on the skyline, to me that's a happy thing. That's a good thing. Change is good. Growth is good. The alternative of, I went to where my dad used to work. The IBM plant is vacant. There's nothing there. Blocks and blocks of buildings where there's nothing happening. I mean, to me, that's depressing. I see the growth as an opportunity. It's something that's positive. We shouldn't be afraid of it. We don't necessarily. There could be negative aspects to it as well, but overall, I just see it as if it's planned out properly, that it's a good thing.
And there is a whole lot of growth going on right now. At this very moment, as we speak, there is all kinds of development that's happening all across Alexandria, where the city is accomplishing this goal of creating new affordable housing units, working with the Alexandria Housing Development Corporation, working with other nonprofit developers like AHC, Wesley Homes. That project there, Station of Potomac Yard, is really a turning point in the history of affordable housing. Gone are the days when the city was trying to get its hands on a bunch of old garden apartments to renovate them. Now, the city is building its way out of the affordable housing crisis with places like the Carpenter Shelter, right? This is one of your projects, right? So this is 8 $8.8 million of city money. So, that penny set aside no longer exists, but now we get money from the restaurant diners, right?
Very controversial.
Very controversial, but this is where all that money is going, projects like the Bloom, right? Talk a little bit about what's happening at this site that our listeners are going to be familiar with, the Carpenter Shelter. What's going on there?
Yeah, so for those who are familiar with Carpenter Shelter, fantastic organization. They do incredible work. Their building was a 1970s DMV in a highly developing, high opportunity neighborhood. And so they got into conversation with AHDC about what to do to preserve this location, to look at the long-term future of what they're going to do. And in addition, maybe get into a building that's purpose-built for a shelter's needs and not a former DMV. So they're working with us, and what we're going to do, they have the move right now, so they're located in Macy's over at Landmark Mall that had a lot of publicity this past summer. And then we are tearing down their existing shelter. We're going to build a new one in its place. It'll be a purpose-built shelter, new administrative offices, new facilities, new kitchen, with underground parking, so we'll better use the land space there for them. And then on top of that, we're adding 97 units of affordable housing. And this partnership was really naturally born because the homeless services providers is really attached to affordable housing. These two issues co-locate with each other very naturally. So we have the 97 units of housing, 10 of which will be reserved for former Carpenters residents who will continue to get wraparound care. And then they will be standard leaseholders of AHDC, but they will receive services from Carpenters as well, in addition to other shared amenities that we're looking at. So this is kind of a really big one that we have right now going on in North Old Town, and really getting a chance to keep Carpenters in that high opportunity area, add affordable housing to this really great location as well, just a stone's throw from Braddock Road, right on Route 1, as the rest of the area is really starting to grow and develop as well.
Definitely. So I think that's terrific, and that project has gotten a lot of attention, which is understandable because, like you said, Kayla, the Carpenter Shelter has done such a great job being a partner with the city. But my question is, Kayla and Helen, so we say 97 units are going to be built at the new Carpenter Shelter, and the number of units that were built at Potomac Yard and the fire station. My question is, I know that since 2000, Alexandria's lost 90% of its affordable housing, like it had at that point in time.
Of its market affordable housing. These were regular apartments that had no, restrictions on them.
And the other statistic that I just thought was so interesting was that since then we've lost 16,000 homes or residences. That is comparable to the entire population of Falls Church, at Falls Church City. I just think is so fascinating. So my question is there some tally that someone is keeping where, okay, we've lost this many, we're building this many, when will we know when we get there?
The answer to your question, Eileen, is that there is a goal the city created about 5 years ago, and the city is not meeting that goal, right? It's about, I think, about halfway toward meeting. Well, in terms of where the city thought it was going to be 5 years ago, it's only accomplished about half of that.
It has, although we have many more units, several hundred units in the pipeline that are approved and right now in the city, we have the Lacey Court renovation, we have Ramsey Homes, the Arha property that's being constructed right now. We have Carpenter Shelter, we have the Gateway at King and Beauregard, and we have the Spire, which was just approved. And then in a couple of weekends, City Council, it was unanimously approved at Planning Commission last night, but we'll have the Fairlington Presbyterian Church redevelopment. So we've got a lot going on, but you're right, Michael. Our target when we did the Housing Master Plan in 2013 was new affordability in 2,000 units by 2025, sort of the horizon year for the Housing Master Plan.
Which is about 200 units a year, right?
It's about 200 units a year. And when you talked earlier about increasing the tax rate on a restaurant meal, that was partly because we realized we would need additional financial resources just to meet that target. I did want to say, when you mentioned the city's investment in Carpenter Shelter, first, when we participate financially, it's a loan that is repaid over time. it's repaid over a long time. So it's not, we continually need to find resources for housing because these are 40-year loans, and typically there are opportunities before the 40 years, but it's repaid to the city over a long time and will be resources. But we're just one of the investors in these projects. I think Carpenter Shelter is about a $50 million project.
Yes.
And so our $8.8 million is leveraged many times over with tax credit equity, with private financing. So
And the state and national housing trust funds as well.
that's right. It's our first Alexandria project to get some new funds that were competitively awarded.
So one of the other really exciting developments in the affordable housing world is another one of your projects, Kayla, the Gateway Apartments out on the West End. That actually merges a whole bunch of stuff together, including transit.
More stuff on top of stuff.
Stuff on top of
it's
stuff.
stuff on top of stuff on top
I'm
of stuff on
loving
top of stuff. To talk about what's happened, this exciting development on the West End of Alexandria.
So the Gateway development is it's at King and Beauregard, really close to the Arlington switch. And what that's going to be is 74 units of housing for us. On top of ground level, it'll be office, retail, fast casual. There's a Harris Teeter
Fast
in the
casual.
works. I think that's Chipotle.
Oh, got
Yes.
it. Thank you. I didn't know that was called fast casual.
I'm hoping it's a Chipotle. I need one closer to me. But so we'll be adding 74 units of housing above ground level retail options. In addition to, there will be other market rate properties and office space within this entire development, in addition to underground parking. And then the exciting thing is it's planned on the city's West End Transitway. So it really kind of ties into when we're talking about adding more people and adding more units, and as we develop, being smart and managing and adding this development onto a location that will increase transportation options for the people who are living there. We're actually looking forward to one of the planned amenities we have for this building will be transit screen technology, so our residents will have access to bus schedules and metro schedules in the lobby of the building. We're very excited about that. But so the Gateway it's really a partnership with the market rate developers who are there, in addition to the transportation elements and everything that's coming into play.
And I would say Kayla brings up a point. We're always looking to tweak our policies to maximize opportunities for affordable housing. And the whole parking issue is one that, we realized that we were putting a lot of money into underground parking because it's a city requirement typically. And people
Which,
who
by
live...
the way, that requirement has been scaled back quite
That's
a
right.
bit.
It's been right-sized because
Right.
we realize that people who live in affordable housing own and use cars very differently from most people. And so when you look at
Even as older people?
utilization rates, I mean, it's generational, but it's also whether people want to bear the expense of owning and maintaining vehicles and insuring them when we have so many transit options. So it's something we've seen dramatic shifts in.
Now, we could talk about the subject of affordable housing all day, but
That sounds like a good day.
it does sound like a good day.
Sounds like my
but for the
every day.
purposes of our conversation, we probably need to wrap it up. I want to end on an urban legend about affordable housing, which involves the station at Potomac Yard, which is a fulcrum in our discussion about affordable housing because it really changed the city's approach to affordable housing. And Helen knows exactly what I'm about to say. The urban legend involves the design of stuff on top of stuff being drawn on a cocktail napkin. Is this true, Helen?
I'd like to think it is. I have to say the concept for the station actually occurred a couple of weeks before I joined the city in 2006. So the cocktail napkin story has been repeated to me.
Now, was it a cocktail napkin like at Landini Brothers where they were having martinis?
Well, that's the only part of the story.
It was a cocktail
There are
involved.
not many city events that involve cocktails or napkins, I think the fact that the project has turned out so well and is just such a creative idea. We have many, many people who like to claim that they were behind the idea. And so I like to think of it as, political, our elected leaders, the project managers from Potomac Yard, and other smart people. The way the story goes is that when the first plans for Potomac Yard actually came in, and there were so many Muse-style townhomes, there were both anecdotal and sort of remarks among the staff reviewing it saying, it's going to be very tough for our fire engines to navigate these narrow streets, and that's going to impact response times. And the developer said, well, what if we gave you land for a fire station here? And the city jumped on it and then said, and what other, just as you said, happened at the Chamber of Commerce event, smart people said, well, we shouldn't just build a one-story fire station. What else can we do with this land and this building? And so I am still looking for the cocktail napkin. I do have, as a result of our conversation a few months ago, I did get one of the early drawings, but I will say it was not the cocktail napkin. and I think I remember that I actually saw something, maybe not a cocktail napkin, but sketch paper with an early rendering.
That's not as good of a story.
It's not as good of a story.
I'll draw on a cocktail napkin and we can hide it in a file somewhere.
I've thought of getting, the person who, as I understand it, Al Cox, who is still with the city and is our historic preservation manager, was in an architect role at that time. And I definitely saw some of Al's early drawings and could believe that someone would have viewed those as a cocktail napkin. But it's a great story.
It is a great story.
I think the moral of the story, too, Michael, might be that perhaps with more cocktails, we'll get more affordable housing in Alexandria.
and more, well, I think the other thing that project speaks to is when the city acts entrepreneurially,
There you
how
go.
cool that can be, because many of the things that sometimes hold us back were, we were told, go do this and make it happen, and it was a very exciting time.
You have been listening to the On the Agenda podcast, a production of Agenda Alexandria. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and subscribe to our podcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Kayla.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for